As dawn slowly broke over the English Channel, the outline of the French coastline emerged through the morning haze. After hours at sea, the soldiers could finally see the land they had heard so much about during months of training. It appeared almost peaceful from a distance. The beaches stretched along the coast, backed by green fields and gentle hills that gave little indication of the battle about to unfold. For a brief moment, it was difficult to believe that this quiet shoreline had become one of the most heavily fortified places in Europe. Inside the landing craft, conversations faded. Most of the men had little left to say. Their attention was fixed on the coastline growing larger with every passing minute. Some tightened the straps on their helmets or checked their rifles one final time. Others simply stared ahead in silence, trying to steady their breathing. Every soldier understood that there was no turning back. The sea behind them was now filled with thousands of Allied ships, while ahead stood the German Atlantic Wall, defended by experienced troops who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the distant thunder of naval artillery. Massive battleships positioned offshore began firing toward the German defenses, their shells streaking across the sky before crashing into bunkers and fortified positions along the coast. Soon afterward, waves of Allied aircraft roared overhead, dropping bombs in an effort to weaken the enemy before the landings began. The ground ahead disappeared beneath clouds of smoke and dust. From the boats, it was impossible to know how much damage had actually been done. Many soldiers hoped the bombardment had destroyed the strongest defenses, but no one could be certain. As the landing craft drew closer, the details of the shoreline became clearer. Wooden stakes, steel obstacles, and rows of mines emerged from the water, all carefully placed to destroy landing craft before they could reach the beach. Behind them, concrete bunkers overlooked the open sand, giving German machine gun crews clear fields of fire. What had seemed peaceful only minutes earlier now revealed itself as a carefully engineered battlefield. The movement of the boat slowed as they entered the shallow water. Around them, dozens of other landing craft advanced toward the same beaches, each carrying men with the same mixture of fear, determination, and uncertainty. Smoke drifted across the coastline, explosions echoed from every direction, and the first reports of heavy resistance began to spread among the approaching waves. The invasion had begun, and there was no longer any doubt that the defenders were ready. The soldiers stood as the coxswain shouted final instructions over the roar of engines and exploding shells. The heavy steel ramp at the front of the landing craft remained closed, separating them from the chaos outside for only a few more moments. Many later recalled that these final seconds felt longer than the entire journey across the channel. Hearts pounded, hands gripped weapons tightly, and every man waited for the same sound, the command to move forward. Then, with a loud metallic crash, the ramp began to lower. For the men inside the boat, the waiting was over. The battle for Normandy had begun. The moment the ramps dropped, the relative safety of the landing craft vanished. German machine guns, positioned high above the beach in reinforced bunkers, opened fire almost immediately. Bullets swept across the water before many soldiers had even taken their first steps. Some men were forced to jump into water deeper than expected, weighed down by nearly 70 pounds of equipment that threatened to pull them beneath the surface. Training had prepared them to move quickly toward the shore, but nothing could prepare them for the confusion, noise, and violence that greeted them that morning. The sea itself became part of the battlefield. Landing craft struggled to reach the beach through mines and underwater obstacles, while shells from German artillery exploded among the incoming waves. Soldiers fought not only against enemy fire but also against strong currents, heavy packs, and the desperate effort to keep their weapons dry. Veterans later recalled that time seemed to lose all meaning. The carefully planned invasion instantly became a struggle to survive 1 minute, then the next. Commands were often drowned out by explosions, and many small units became separated before they even reached the sand. Those who made it ashore found little protection. The beach was wide and exposed, leaving many soldiers pinned down behind obstacles, shallow depressions in the sand, or the seawall whenever they could reach it. German defensive positions overlooked nearly every approach, making even short movements incredibly dangerous. Medics moved from one wounded man to another despite the constant gunfire, while engineers attempted to clear obstacles that blocked the advance of men and vehicles. Individual acts of courage happened everywhere, often unnoticed in the chaos surrounding them. Despite the overwhelming resistance, the invasion did not stop. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes led by officers and sometimes simply by whoever was willing to move first, began finding gaps in the German defenses. They crawled through barbed wire, climbed steep embankments, and worked their way toward the bluffs overlooking the beach. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles, and every small gain came at a tremendous cost. The battle was no longer unfolding according to the carefully prepared plans. Instead, it depended on the determination, initiative, and resilience of ordinary men making countless decisions under extraordinary pressure. For many survivors, the memory that remained strongest was not a single dramatic event but the relentless effort to keep moving forward. Fear was constant, but so was the determination to help the man beside them. Soldiers carried wounded comrades to safety, shared ammunition when supplies ran low, and continued advancing despite exhaustion and uncertainty. They were no longer thinking about the enormous significance of Operation Overlord or the future liberation of Europe. Their world had narrowed to the next few yards of sand, the next obstacle, and the hope of surviving long enough to reach solid ground beyond the beach. By late morning, isolated groups of Allied soldiers had begun to break through the German defenses overlooking Omaha Beach. The foothold was fragile and had been won at an immense cost, but it existed. The invasion had survived its most dangerous hours. The men who had crossed the channel that morning had accomplished what many believed would be impossible. The road into occupied France had begun, not through a single decisive victory, but through thousands of individual moments of courage, sacrifice, and determination. By early afternoon, the battle had begun to change. The beaches were still dangerous, and German artillery continued to fire from positions farther inland, but the first waves of Allied soldiers had achieved something many believed might be impossible. They had survived the landing and established a foothold in occupied France. The fight, however, was far from over. Leaving the beach meant climbing the steep bluffs overlooking the shoreline, crossing hedgerows that divided the Norman countryside, and confronting German defenders who were determined to slow every advance. The invasion was no longer about reaching the shore, it had become a battle to move inland, one field and one village at a time. The landscape of Normandy presented challenges that few of the soldiers had anticipated. Beyond the beaches lay a maze of narrow country lanes, thick hedgerows, orchards, and small farms. These centuries-old hedgerows, some rising higher than a man's head, formed natural defensive barriers that limited visibility and made every field a potential ambush. German troops who had survived the naval bombardment used this terrain to their advantage, forcing Allied soldiers to fight for every position. Progress was often measured in hundreds of yards over the course of an entire day, and each advance demanded careful coordination, patience, and courage. As the fighting spread inland, the invasion became a series of countless small battles fought by scattered groups of soldiers. Units that had landed together on the beach were often separated by the confusion of combat, forcing officers and enlisted men alike to adapt quickly. Communication was difficult, maps were sometimes unreliable, and smoke from burning vehicles and shellfire obscured the landscape. Success often depended on the initiative of small groups making decisions without waiting for orders. Veterans later recalled that leadership frequently came from whoever was willing to stand up and move forward, regardless of rank. Among the villages and fields of Normandy, civilians emerged cautiously from homes, barns, and cellars where they had sheltered during the bombardment. For many French families, this was the first sign that liberation had finally arrived after 4 years of German occupation. Some greeted Allied soldiers with quiet smiles or gestures of gratitude, while others remained fearful, uncertain of what the coming days would bring. The fighting was not over, and many communities would soon find themselves caught between retreating German forces and advancing Allied troops. As evening approached on June 6, Allied commanders began assessing the results of the first day. Not every objective had been achieved, and several beaches had suffered far heavier casualties than expected, particularly Omaha Beach. Yet despite the setbacks, the invasion had succeeded in its most essential goal. The Allies had secured positions on the coast of Normandy. Reinforcements, vehicles, medical supplies, and equipment continued to arrive throughout the day, strengthening the fragile bridgehead that had been established through extraordinary sacrifice. For the soldiers who survived those first hours, there was little sense of celebration. Exhaustion had replaced adrenaline, and the reality of the losses weighed heavily on everyone. Friends who had stood beside them only hours earlier were now missing, wounded, or dead. There was little time to process these emotions because the campaign in Normandy had only just begun. The liberation of France would require weeks of difficult fighting, and the road to Germany was still hundreds of miles away. As darkness settled over the Normandy countryside, the men who had landed that morning prepared for another uncertain night. They dug foxholes, tended to the wounded, shared what little food and water they had, and listened to the distant sounds of gunfire echoing across the fields. They had crossed the English Channel, survived one of the most dangerous military operations in history, and established the first step toward the liberation of Western Europe. The longest day was coming to an end. But the war was not. When the fighting finally began to slow on the evening of June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy revealed the true cost of the invasion. The noise of constant gunfire gave way to the quieter sounds of medics calling for supplies, engineers clearing obstacles, and soldiers searching for missing members of their units. The beaches that had been the objective only hours earlier were now covered with abandoned equipment, damaged landing craft, destroyed vehicles, and the unmistakable evidence of a battle that had demanded an enormous sacrifice. For the men who survived, the overwhelming feeling was not triumph, but disbelief that they were still alive. Throughout the day, medical teams had worked under extraordinary conditions. Many medics crossed open stretches of sand again and again to reach wounded soldiers, often exposing themselves to the same enemy fire that had already claimed so many lives. Field hospitals were established as quickly as possible, where doctors and nurses treated an endless stream of casualties with limited equipment and little opportunity to rest. Every effort was made to save lives, but the scale of the invasion meant that many injuries were simply too severe. The courage shown by medical personnel on D-Day became one of the defining stories of the operation, remembered by countless veterans who owed their survival to those who refused to abandon the wounded. As reports arrived from the different landing beaches, Allied commanders gradually understood the full picture. The invasion had succeeded, but it had come at a tremendous cost. More than 10,000 Allied troops were killed, wounded, or reported missing on D-Day, including approximately 4,400 confirmed dead. German casualties were also significant, though exact numbers remain uncertain. Behind every statistic was an individual life, a son, a brother, a husband, or a father whose story ended on the beaches or in the fields of Normandy. The numbers recorded in military reports could never fully capture the grief that would soon reach families across Europe and North America. In the days and weeks that followed, letters and telegrams began arriving in homes thousands of miles away. Some families learned that their loved one had survived the invasion. Others received the message every family feared, informing them that a son or husband had been killed in action. For many, those few words marked the beginning of a lifetime of remembrance. The victory at Normandy would eventually help bring an end to the war in Europe, but for countless families, that victory would always carry the memory of someone who never came home. The soldiers who survived rarely described themselves as heroes. In interviews recorded decades later, many spoke instead about luck. They remembered the friends who had stood beside them that morning but disappeared during the battle. They recalled moments of fear, confusion, and exhaustion far more vividly than moments of courage. Again and again, veterans emphasized that they had simply done what they believed was necessary, relying on one another to endure circumstances that no training exercise could truly prepare them for. Today, the beaches of Normandy are peaceful places. Visitors walk across the same sand where thousands of young men once fought for survival, often finding it difficult to imagine the violence that unfolded there on June 6, 1944. Memorials, museums, and military cemeteries now stand as quiet reminders of the price that was paid. They honor not only those who lost their lives, but also the generation whose determination changed the course of history. The story of D-Day is remembered because of strategy and military achievement, but it endures because it was lived by ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances with remarkable courage. In the years that followed the war, many of the men who survived D-Day found it difficult to speak about what they had experienced. Some rarely discussed it at all, even with their own families. Others shared only small fragments of their memories, not because they had forgotten, but because certain moments remained too vivid to put into words. They remembered the sound of the landing craft cutting through the waves before dawn, the silence that settled over the men as the coast of France came into view, and the overwhelming noise that followed when the ramps finally opened. These were memories that stayed with them for the rest of their lives, long after the uniforms had been folded away and the war had become history. As the decades passed, the beaches of Normandy slowly returned to peace. The scars of battle faded beneath grass, dunes, and quiet villages rebuilt after the fighting. Children played where soldiers had once struggled to survive. Fishing boats crossed waters that had carried the greatest invasion fleet ever assembled. Visitors arrived from around the world, standing on Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches, often surprised by how calm and beautiful they seemed. Without the memorials, museums, and preserved bunkers, it would be difficult to imagine that these peaceful shores had witnessed one of the most significant days of the 20th century. For historians, D-Day is remembered as a decisive military operation that marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. They study maps, analyze strategies, and debate the decisions made by commanders. Those details are essential because they explain how the invasion succeeded despite extraordinary challenges. But for the soldiers who were there, history was never experienced as arrows moving across a map. It was experienced one heartbeat at a time. It was the weight of a soaked uniform, the exhaustion of carrying heavy equipment across open sand, the fear of taking another step under enemy fire, and the determination to keep moving because the man beside you was doing the same. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson left behind by those who lived through D-Day. History is not only the story of nations, generals, and battles. It is also the story of ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things. The men who landed in Normandy were farmers, mechanics, students, teachers, clerks, and factory workers before the war. They did not know they would become part of one of history's defining moments. They simply answered a call that demanded courage beyond anything they had previously known. Today, as fewer veterans remain to tell their stories firsthand, preserving their experiences has become more important than ever. Every letter, diary, interview, and photograph reminds us that behind every historical event are real human lives. The invasion of Normandy changed the course of the Second World War, but it also changed the lives of every individual who stepped onto those beaches. Some returned home carrying memories that never left them. Others never returned at all, leaving future generations to remember the sacrifice they made. So when we think about D-Day, it is worth remembering more than the date, June 6, 1944, or the military operation known as Operation Overlord. It is worth remembering the human experience behind those names. The uncertainty of waiting. The fear of the crossing. The courage required to leave the landing craft. The determination to move forward despite overwhelming danger. These are the moments that transformed history, not because they belong to legendary heroes, but because they belong to ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances. That is what it felt like. Not simply to witness history, but to live it.